This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 28, verse 1. Woe to the crown of pride of the drunkards of Ephraim, and to the fading flower of his glorious beauty, which is on the head of the fertile valley of those who are overcome with wine. Comment, if we simplify the sentence, it's woe to the drunkards of Ephraim who are overcome with wine. Ephraim was the leading tribe of the northern kingdom. Ephraim wears a crown of pride. That beauty of that land is fading. They're drunk with pride. They wear their pride like a crown. They reject Yahweh. Coming up, God's not impressed. He has a crown of his own, a mighty and strong one. Verse 2. Behold, the Lord has a mighty and strong one, like a storm of hail, a destroying storm, and like a storm of mighty waters overflowing. He'll cast them down to the earth with his hand. The crown of pride of the drunkards of Ephraim will be trodden underfoot. The fading flower of his glorious beauty, which is on the head of the fertile valley, shall be like the first ripe fig before the summer, which someone picks and eats as soon as he sees it. Comment in verse 2, God will come at Ephraim like a hailstorm, and using another metaphor, like a raging flood. He'll cast Ephraim down to the earth. The fulfillment of it was in Isaiah's lifetime when the Assyrians invaded. It was a treading down of their crown of pride in verse 3. In verse 4, there's the head of the fertile valley, which is Samaria, the capital city. It was the head of the fertile valley because it overlooked a fertile valley in Ephraim. Just to clarify, Samaria has three definitions. It was a city, and in a larger sense, it was the surrounding region or the entire northern kingdom. In verses 1 and 4, the head of the fertile valley is the city. The city wore a fading flower of beauty. Coming up, Isaiah switches to the future by saying, in that day. By now, that's familiar to us as a coming age in which God will set things right. The pattern is that God speaks of miseries and failures and disasters in the present and future, then follows that up with how he'll remedy everything in the coming day. He specifically speaks of evils of the present age as they existed in the known world or as they would soon occur in the known world, but the remedy for those evils applies to the entire earth. The earth fell under a curse in Genesis 3, but in that day the curse will be lifted. God will gather his people from every nation, defeat their enemies, create paradise, and there will be the direct presence of God. Verse 5. In that day Yahweh of armies will become a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the residue of his people, and a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment, and strength to those who turn back the battle at the gate. Comment in verse 5, there'll be a residue of his people, also translated remnant. Remnant means those who remain. His remnant will not perish. They'll be present in that day. How's that possible? 2 chapters ago, God said his own who dwell in the dust will rise. The earth will cast out the departed spirits, Isaiah 26:19. So the remnant will take part in that day through resurrection. In verse 5, in that day the remnant won't crown themselves with pride. They won't be intoxicated with pride. They'll glory in Yahweh. He'll be their crown of beauty. Rather than being drunk, they'll be in their right minds. In verse 6, he who sits in judgment will know justice and how to apply it. And in verse 6, he who protects the gate from invaders will be strong in battle. He'll turn the invaders back. There'll be no chance that an enemy can gain entry. In Revelation 21:27, there will in no way enter into that city anything profane or one who causes an abomination or a lie, end quote. Already we have a spirit of wisdom, justice, and strength, but in that day we'll have those qualities in fullness. Back to Isaiah's time, using Ephraim as an example, verse 7, they also reel with wine and stagger with strong drink. The priest and the prophet reel with strong drink. They're swallowed up by wine. They stagger with strong drink. They err in vision. They stumble in judgment. For all tables are completely full of filthy vomit and filthiness. Comment in verses 7 and 8, Ephraim's drunk with pride and arrogance against God. Everything is darkness, chaos, injustice, failure, filth, and defeat. It's all characteristic of the present age. We eat from a table of filthy vomit and filthiness in this age. There are lots of foul things being said and done. Verse 9, whom will he teach knowledge? To whom will he explain the message? those who are weaned from milk and drawn from the breasts, for it's precept on precept, precept on precept, line on line, line on line, here a little, there a little. But he'll speak to this nation with stammering lips and in another language, to whom he said, This is the resting place, give rest to the weary, and this is the refreshing, yet they would not hear. Therefore Yahweh's word will be to them precept on precept, precept on precept, line on line, line on line, here a little, there a little, that they may go, fall backward, be broken, be snared, and be taken. Comment, Isaiah said in chapter 11, verse 9, that in that day the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. But in the present age, the knowledge of God isn't so widespread. The knowledge of God isn't so easy to come by. If we learn of Him, it's not ordinarily in a massive download, but slowly, precept on precept, line on line, here a little, there a little, in verse 10. In verse 11, when God speaks, it's as if it's in a dialect we can barely understand. It's mysteries and riddles because of our present dullness. If He pleases, He interprets for us. He opens our minds to understand the Scriptures, Luke 24:45. But in the coming age, we won't be so dull. In verse 9, we're slow to learn like children just weaned from the breast. We can't handle a lot of information, but in that day we'll be able to absorb it without effort. In verse 13, in the present age, we're spiritual cripples. We fall backward, are broken, snared, and taken. But in the coming day, we'll have understanding so that we don't stumble. We'll know justice. We won't go astray. We'll be strong to turn back the enemy. Now, turning from the situation in Ephraim to Judah, from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom, and to the southern kingdom's royal city, Jerusalem, verse 14. Therefore hear Yahweh's word, you scoffers that rule this people in Jerusalem. Because you've said, we've made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we're in agreement. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it won't come to us, for we've made lies our refuge, and we've hidden ourselves under falsehood. Comment in verses 14 and 15, Jerusalem falsely presumes nothing bad will happen, that whatever scourge passes through won't affect them. They scoff at God in verse 14 and replace the knowledge of God with lies and falsehoods. They've exchanged the covenant with God for a covenant with death and hell, and they think they're safe. Speaking of how God will address that, verse 16. Therefore thus says the Lord Yahweh, Behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. He who believes shall not act hastily. I'll make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line. The hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the hiding place. Your covenant with death shall be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge passes through, then you'll be trampled down by it. As often as it passes through, it will seize you, for morning by morning it will pass through, by day and by night, and it'll be nothing but terror to understand the message. For the bed is too short to stretch out on, and the blanket is too narrow to wrap oneself in. For Yahweh will rise up as on Mount Perazim. He'll be angry as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his unusual work, and bring to pass his act, his extraordinary act. Now therefore don't be scoffers, lest your bonds be made strong. For I have heard a decree of destruction from the Lord, Yahweh of armies, on the whole earth. Comment in verses 14 and 15, Scoffers rule Jerusalem. The rulers scoff at God. They've made a covenant with death and agreement with Sheol. God will remedy that in verse 16 by laying a cornerstone of a sure foundation. Peter quoted this cornerstone verse from Isaiah and said the cornerstone is Jesus, 1 Peter 2, 5 and 6. Paul said the same, Ephesians 2:20, and Jesus said the same, Luke 20:17. So there's triple confirmation. The cornerstone is Jesus. Jesus is the remedy for the evils and ignorance of the present age. The cornerstone is laid first. Every other stone lines up after it. If we line up with Jesus, we're in covenant and agreement with God. If we don't line up with Him, we're in covenant and agreement with death and hell. In the second sentence of verse 16, he who believes shall not act hastily. Peter's rendering of that line was, he who believes in Him shall not be disappointed, 1 Peter 2:6. In verse 17, still using the construction of a stone building as a metaphor, justice will be the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line. God is the builder. He'll put this work together with righteousness and justice. It'll all be square and plumb. It'll all be done right. There'll be no faulty construction, no unrighteousness or injustice. He won't cheat on any of his principles as he carries out this plan of redemption. He won't cut any corners. In verse 17, quote, "The hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the hiding place," end quote. Evil men take refuge in lies. They cover their tracks with deception. God will expose and sweep away every evil. In verse 18, quote, "Your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol shall not stand," end quote. Our covenant with death will be annulled. In verses 18 and 20, whenever there's an overflowing scourge, which is an overwhelming problem, whenever that scourge tramples us as often as it passes through, seizing us morning, by day and by night, terrorizing us, we're to take a lesson from all of it. We're to, quote, "understand the message," end quote. Life's difficulties are a message to us. In verse 20, quote, "For the bed is too short and the blanket too narrow to wrap oneself," end quote. That's a description of life. Even when there's not some extreme thing pressing in on us, there's always some type of aggravation. Even the little things are a message that the difficulties of life, big or small, will ultimately destroy us. We'll either die by some single thrust of the sword or by 1,000 small cuts. The world will claim us unless God intervenes and does something amazing. Then in verse 21, Yahweh will rise up as on Mount Perazim. Perazim was where God broke out against the Philistines, 2 Samuel 5:20. He'll rise up and destroy the evils of the present age as he rose up against the Philistines. Then in verse 21, God will be angry as in the valley of Gibeon. That was where 5 Canaanite kings fought Israel, but God destroyed them, Joshua 10:10. The point is that God will rise up in anger against all the evils and difficulties of the present age, all the ones mentioned in this chapter and all the rest of them, all the pride, intoxication, errors in vision, errors in judgment, filth, lack of knowledge, weariness, stumbling, snares, death, scourges, lies, hidden evils, injustice, unrighteousness, covenants with death, agreements with hell, terrors, and even the small aggravations. He'll cancel all that. He'll redeem creation. In verse 21, he'll perform that work in anger. It'll be unusual and extraordinary. In verse 22, quote, "Now therefore don't be scoffers, lest your bonds be made strong, for I've heard a decree of destruction from the Lord, Yahweh of armies, on the whole earth," end quote. In other words, don't scoff or you'll remain bound. Your difficulties will continue. Isaiah heard God that he's issued a decree of destruction. So let's not be in covenant with death and hell, or we'll be caught up in God's anger. Let's line up with the cornerstone. In verse 22, this applies to the quote, whole earth, end quote. It's a whole earth prophecy, not something specific to Jerusalem, Judah, Israel, Ephraim, Samaria, or any other particular locale. God continues his appeal, verse 23. "Give ear and hear my voice. Listen and hear my speech. Does he who plows to sow plow continually? Does he keep turning the soil and breaking the clods? When he's leveled its surface, doesn't he plant the dill and scatter the cumin seed and put in the wheat in rows, the barley in the appointed place, and the spelt in its place? For his God instructs him in right judgment and teaches him. For the dill are not threshed with a sharp instrument, neither is a cartwheel turned over the cumin, but the dill is beaten out with a stick, and the cumin with a rod. Bread flour must be ground, so he'll not always be threshing it. Although he drives the wheel of his threshing cart over it, his horses don't grind it. This also comes out from Yahweh of armies, who's wonderful in counsel and excellent in wisdom." Comment verses 23 to 29, listen carefully to what God says. The farmer doesn't plow forever. He goes from one phase to the next according to the good sense God gave him in verse 26. Instead of plowing continually, he then plants, using whatever planting technique according to the crop. Then there's harvesting by the technique unique to each crop. Then threshing in the case of some crops. and then in the case of grain, on to grinding. Everything has to be done in order to completion with skill and knowledge. In the parable, God is the farmer. He knows what he's doing. We're the crop. He plants us in our appointed place. He raises us up skillfully and with purpose according to the need of the individual. He sees us through to the final product. Some of us even require threshing and grinding. Everything is step by step according to his wisdom and understanding. When it comes to threshing, we feel like we're being beaten. When it comes to grinding, that's hard too. In the world you'll have tribulation, Jesus said, John 16:33. But God won't thresh or grind continually. In that day the job will be done, and the tribulations of this age will be behind us. In the last verse, this process comes from Yahweh. He's wonderful in counsel and excellent in wisdom. There's good sense to all of it. He'll tend to us skillfully and see us through. Isaiah 29 is next.